So let's talk about maternity. So my first question that I asked about maternity is when to move cows into a maternity pen. So sometimes, every farm does something a little bit different. There's certainly no one-size-fits-all answer to this question. But often, some farms use the close-up pen as the maternity, so cows are moved in a couple of weeks before into a bedded pack, and that's where they end up calving. Others have free stalls that cows are in the close-up, and then cows are moved into an individual pen or into a group bedded pack, either a couple days before calving or during labor when they see signs of labor. So we did a study. This was on a small sample of animals, but we wanted to ask that question. If you moved cows at different stages of labor, would it influence their ability to give birth and to go through labor normally? Because there was questions about, well, if you move them while they're in labor, is it going to interfere with their ability to calve normally? So before I talk about the study, we'll talk just quickly about the stages of labor in cows, because this kind of helps illustrate what we did. So there's 3 stages of labor in cattle. 2 happen before she gives birth, and the 3rd happens after she gives birth. The first stage is really difficult to know. Obviously, we all know this. This is when the calf is moving into the correct position for calving, and the cervix of the cow begins to dilate. So there's subtle signs during this time, but it's not quite as obvious as stage 2. So here you might see things like some mucus, and we'll talk about some behavioral changes that happen here as well a little bit later, but some things you might see are, the cows becoming more restless. They might be starting to leak milk, or at least you see their udders become pretty engorged. If you can palpate their ligaments in the back, the tail head ligament, it starts to relax, and you start to feel that relax. They go off feed. If you have a rumination collar on them, you see that they stop ruminating during this time period. So they certainly show some subtle changes. In the second stage, the calf is this is called sort of the active stage of labor. So the calf is actively moving through the birth canal. So it's a bit more obvious because you start to see the calf. So the first thing you see is the amniotic sac, and then you do see the legs, hopefully 2 front legs, and you see the nose of the calf. And then by the end of stage 2 is the calf is on the ground. The other thing that you see is the cow laying down and spending a lot of time laying down, and the contractions where here in stage 1, she is starting to have some contractions in her uterus. But in stage 2, it's actually her abdomen that's having contractions. So you see her whole stomach start to move really rhythmically as she's pushing that calf out with all of her strength. In stage 3, the placenta is released. So we're not going to spend too much time on stage 3, but we'll focus more on stage 1 and stage 2. So we moved cows before any signs of labor. Obviously, we didn't palpate the cervix, so we didn't know exactly when the cow started having labor, but that was before any signs. And this was approximately 24 hours before calving. So somewhere between 12 and 24 hours without these signs of labor. We had another group that was what we called early stage 1. So these were cows that were moved. So I'll go back a little bit. These cows were moved from a group pen, a bedded pack, into a individual box stall for them to give birth. And so early stage 1, we started to see the signs that I've already talked about, like relaxed ligaments, the udder becoming engorged or leaky, probably a combination of these things. Tail, I forgot to mention also, the tail is raised for longer than just urinating or defecating, but they're standing there with their tail raised. So these were some of the signs that we saw in this group. And then we had a group that we weren't quite sure about. We called them late stage 1, but they were probably kind of in between stage 1 and stage 2. So we saw the first signs of abdominal contractions in these cows. and they were showing some mucus or some blood in their mucus. And these cows, the early stage 1, were about 6 to 12 hours before calving. And then these cows were less than about 4 hours before calving, where they moved into the individual pen. We were hoping to get some more cows in stage 2, but we were actually only checking on the cows, and we had our farm staff check on the cows every 4 hours, which obviously was not enough. So stage 2 can be anywhere between 20 minutes to an hour to a little bit over an hour. So we missed a lot of cows that showed the more obvious signs of stage 2, like the amniotic sac. By the time we found them, the calf was already on the ground. So we ended up having this sort of late stage 1 group instead. So this graph will show the length of stage 2 labor. So we measured from the time that she started her abdominal contractions until the time the calf was on the ground. And normally, on average, these were all multi-parous cows, I'll say, and on average, it should be about 60 minutes for that to happen. Some cows will be shorter than that, and some cows may be a little bit longer, but if it's too much longer than that, then it could be that she's experiencing dystocia. And then these were cows, again, moved during early stage 1. And the cows that were moved during late stage 1 or later, closer to giving birth, that's where we saw the differences. So these cows, when we moved them during that later stage, the length of labor increased, which kind of fit well with what we had expected, is that we were interfering with this cow in the middle of labor, and this seems to be a particularly sensitive time of labor for the cow, maybe as she's transitioning to stage 2, as the calf is starting to move through the birth canal, and that delayed her labor by almost an hour and a half. So she definitely had she had about an hour and a half length of stage 2 labor, which was about half an hour longer than these other cows. So the other thing we looked at was her line time, because we expected that these cows would go in, or when they're in the maternity pen in the hour right before calving, like I said earlier, we expect them to lay down and just push that calf out. But what we ended up finding is that these cows, when we moved them really close to calving, they were not interested in laying down and pushing the calf out. They were interested in kind of figuring out where they were, who just moved them, where the feed was, where the water was, what this pen was all about. So it was a novel experience for them. They hadn't been in this pen before. So they spent a lot of time kind of exploring and not spending time laying down, pushing the calf out like we want them to do. So this is sort of a visual, I'll show this picture again, sort of a visual of what you don't want to see of a cow in the middle of labor. So this is actually from our UBC farm, where we have the office. This is the parlor over here. They got nice brushes in their maternity pens, but there's a door here, there's a door here. There's people coming in and out regularly. There's cows coming out to be milked all the time. So again, this is kind of one of those situations. This cow may have been moved just now because that's when the person took the picture of them, but they obviously are not laying down and calving. They look a little bit like they're very vigilant, and they're not doing what we want them to do. So with that study, I get a lot of questions about just-in-time moving, so moving cows when you see the amniotic sac. And unfortunately, we can't really comment on that from the study because we didn't have cows that were in that group that were moved during stage 2, or when you see the sac or the feet. But something that I think is really important is that if you are going to do that just-in-time labor, you have to be checking those cows at least every 20 minutes, if not more often. Because they can push that calf out pretty quickly, especially if they're in a freestall. So I get often asked the question, how many calves are allowed to be calved in the freestall before it's a problem? And for me, that answer is 1, because I don't think any calf should end up in the freestall. And if we talk to people that do a lot of research on calf health, they'll say the same thing, is that calf is in a very vulnerable state, and if she is, or he is born in that freestall environment, where it's not as clean as a maternity pen, and hopefully the maternity pen is clean, then that's very problematic. So doing the just-in-time, I would say, is a challenge. It can be done as long as you're checking very frequently. Otherwise, trying to get them, you also don't want to move the cow into a maternity pen too many days before calving, because that could also increase the risk of other diseases like ketosis. But trying to get them in that sort of 12 to 24 hours before calving seemed to be the best in our study. Obviously, that's not the easiest thing to do, but it's looking for those more subtle signs or seeing the changes that are starting to happen before she gets to the point where the sac is out and the feet are already out. Okay, so moving on from there. So what are features of the ideal maternity pen? So I've already kind of alluded to some of this, and I'll let you guys think about this and talk about this for a bit since I've done a lot of talking. What are things that you want to see in a maternity pen in particular? Or what things do you have in your maternity pen that work really well?
Enough room that they can go off by themselves.
Okay, cool. So an area where they can go off by themselves.
Lots of bedding.
Lots of bedding. Yep, good.
Good light. Good
lighting, yeah. And that's probably more important for us than it is for the cow, but certainly for us to be able to see whether they're, if they need assistance or not. Okay, good. Thank you, Diane. So those are great things to have in the maternity pen, is making sure that there's enough bedding, the bedding is clean and dry for the cow and the calf. Having a space to isolate or to hide is something we are going to talk about, because that's something that we've done a lot of research on, and there's some kind of interesting questions that we still need to ask. But and then the other thing was good ventilation and good lighting. So coming back to our stages of labor here, we're going to talk a little more about some of the cow's behavior around these stages, because this is sort of the perspective that we take with the research, is thinking about what would the cow do in a more natural setting, and can we use that information to help us better design maternity pens in commercial settings. So in that first stage, you see what's called isolation seeking. So this is a picture. Here's a little brown calf here. These are crossbred cows from New Zealand. But there's evidence from beef cattle that are out on range. If you talk to any cow-calf guy, they'll tell you that you find the calf sort of hidden in the back trees or in the tall grass, anywhere around the range where a cow can actually separate herself from the herd to find this more quiet place to give birth. This idea, we're still not 100% sure why the cow does it. So it could be likely due to the fact that it's her way of hiding from predators. She's very vulnerable in this stage, and so is her baby. So it could be an anti-predator strategy where the cow is hiding from potential predators. But the other idea is that the cow is actually hiding from other cows, because any of you who've seen a couple of cows give birth kind of near each other or in a group pen, there's certainly some cows that are more maternal than others. And if these cows were due to calve themselves and have some of the maternal hormones kind of flowing through their veins, they would be very likely to come over here and try to disturb the bond between the dam and the calf. So in the beef industry, the bond between the dam and the calf is extremely important, because it's really the the survival of the calf depends on her ability to bond with her dam. In the dairy industry, we're less interested in that bond, and actually we would rather that they didn't have that bond, or we break that bond pretty early to reduce the stress at separation. But it's still important for us to think about, would she kind of hide even if she wasn't in this more natural environment? So we'll talk a little bit about that. We've already talked about restlessness, and interestingly, the restlessness that we see in indoor barns is probably a combination of her being uncomfortable because she's feeling the calf move around, contractions. I've never had them myself, but I hear they're not very comfortable. So she's probably responding to that, but it could also be that she is looking for a good site to give birth, a good place to give birth. So if you see her kind of roaming around the edge of the pen or trying to kind of find her place to give birth in an indoor setting. She goes off feed, and then she has low rumination time, which we've already talked about. Stage 2, again, we've already talked about. This is where she spends her time just laying down. So not much else to do at that point, but she should be laying down. So this is I'll show you some preliminary data from a study we're doing in collaboration with the University of Tennessee and Minor Institute. So in Tennessee, they have the luxury of pretty warm weather for most of the year, and they do calve some of their cows outside. This is the part of the facility owned by the university, where these are different pastures that they have fenced off here. This one in all these color blocks here, this is one big pasture that we had access to, and we let cows have, this was a barn here where they got a TMR, and they had free access. Their water was also in here, free access to this barn and to this big pasture. And so this was a picture of what the barn looked like on the inside. So you can see the feed bunk is over here. And then it was a straw bedded pack. This is what the pasture looked like. And then there is this area in the back that we tried to leave a little bit rough to allow them to see if they would come back here if they were giving birth. And there's a little bit of tall grass. We left some of this, not quite as rough as in this picture, but it was a bit more hidden than the rest of the pasture. So then we blocked the pasture off. This is that back area here in this block. So each of these blocks is about equal in size. So we looked at where the cows, right now we're going through the video and the students looking at where they're spending time before calving, but right now we at least know where they gave birth. So we counted the number of cows that gave birth in the barn and in each of these different color blocks. I'm sure some of you have some predictions about what the cows did. So far what we found is that about a third of them calved inside the barn. So that wasn't totally surprising to us, but we thought maybe, some of them would find this a good secluded area to give birth, but we really thought that many of them would use this sort of back area of the pasture. A little less than that used any other point of the pasture. So again, if you looked at all of those big blocks, that spread between that whole open area of pasture, only 19 cows gave birth there. So there was a much higher concentration of cows in this one tiny little area here as this big area here. And then about a little over a third of the cows calved in this back pasture. And again, these look like similar numbers, but if you think about it, this is a huge density, 25 cows in one block, as opposed to 19 cows spread between 8 other blocks. So there's certainly a preference for cows to either calve indoors or in this area of more natural forage as opposed to in this open pasture area. So the other thing we did was look at, we had both first calf heifers and older cows in this study, and we wanted to know if their behavior was different. So the latest information that I got from the student running this trial was that there was a difference in where first calf heifers chose to calve versus the older cows. And what we found was that the older cows were more likely to come inside the barn, whereas the first calf heifers were more likely to calve in that back area of pasture. So we're going to do a follow-up study here. We have a couple of ideas about why this is going on. One idea is that these cows previously had given birth inside the barn because they do have maternity pens that they use at certain times of year. And in this particular case, most of these cows had calved in the barn previously, whereas the heifers had never given birth before, so this was their first experience. So previous experience might be influencing this behavior. It may also be that these heifers just might have a stronger innate motivation to leave the herd than the older cows because either they're more subordinate or it's really because it's the first time their hormones are really telling them where to go, as opposed to these cows, again, choosing because they're more comfortable in the barn or because it's similar to where they calved previously. So some kind of interesting data that we're still working through. We had cameras, I think 16 cameras across this entire pasture. So we're going to be able to look at their behavior in more detail and see sort of how they were behaving right before calving and right after calving. So next time I come or give a webinar, I can give you some more details on the findings of that study. But I think what was really interesting here is that they did it did kind of give us a little bit more information about cows, regardless of the fact that they have been domesticated over thousands of years, they still retain that sort of innate motivation to hide right around calving. And either they are looking for this sort of natural forage, or maybe the barn gave them some level of seclusion. So what about in an individual pen? What happened in an indoor barn? So we've talked about cows with access to a barn and pasture, but if cows were just provided access to a maternity pen, do they care about having that area to hide as much as they would in an outdoor setting? So we asked this question in a couple of different ways. This was one of the first studies we did where it's a very impractical maternity pen that I don't imagine anyone would ever build. But we built it because we wanted to ask this research question, which was if we built this kind of crazy shelter or hiding area for the cow in her maternity pen, would she use it? So there was a freestall pen. We ripped out all the freestalls and we made 2 deep-bedded sawdust packs. One that we were calling open. So on this side there's an alley, and on this side there's an alley, and then a shelter. We had multiple replicates of this pen with the shelter on the opposite side as well, and then their feed bunk was on this side. So we put a cow in the pen about 3 days before calving, and we recorded where she spent her time before calving and then where she spent her time during calving. And what we ended up finding was, in general, cows did prefer to calve inside the shelter compared to that open pack. But it wasn't quite as strong as an effect as we had thought it would be. So a majority of them calved in the shelter. But this decision to use the shelter or not was really driven by the time of day of calving. So we looked at cows that calved in the daytime versus at night. And when we looked at it separated, you can see that at night, in the black bars, cows really didn't have a preference. If anything, a few more of them were calving in the open area than in the shelter. But if you look at cows that calved during the daytime, and essentially we started daytime when the barn started, so it was when cows were first fed and sort of noises were first happening, and their first sort of person walking through the barn was coming through. And so you can see that about 80% of the cows that calved during the daytime used the shelter. So there's something about the daytime that motivated these cows to hide in the shelter. We're still not entirely sure what that is, but we think that it likely has to do with the fact that there's more noise and activity in the barn during that time, and so they were more motivated to hide than at night when it was dark and quiet, and maybe it doesn't really make sense for cows to leave the herd in the middle of the night and go find a hiding place. So really the key was that they were more interested to hide in the daytime when it was more noisy and more active in the barn. This graph shows the difference in time spent in the shelter from a baseline period. So this was our way of comparing if a cow was just using the shelter all the time and that's why she calved in the shelter, or did she specifically choose the shelter right around calving time. And what we find in this is we subtracted her behavior in the 12 hours before calving with a 12-hour period a couple of days before. And found that, if it was 0, that means they were spending the same amount of time in the shelter as they were in that 12 hours before. If it was positive, it means they were spending more time in the shelter in the 12 hours before calving. So you can see that it sort of goes a little bit up and down here, but really right around somewhere between like 5 to 8 hours before calving, that's when they start to use that shelter more often. And that could correspond with the first stage of labor when you'd expect them to really start exploring and looking for a place to give birth. So here's a video of a cow using the shelter. So you can see the feet are already out, so she's in her second stage. She's probably checked out of the shelter a few times before. She paws at the ground, which is also a calving behavior. So here's Jason where she backs herself into a corner, which is what you probably said, no corners. And she calves. So there's kind of a couple of interesting things with this video. First is that I do get that question a lot about the corner. And I think when you see cows calving in the corner of a pen, to me, that's telling you that they're looking for seclusion and the closest thing that they can find is that corner. In this case, we didn't have any problems with calves being born into this. This was plywood that we used for this. But if you were to kind of use something, obviously not like this, but if you were to use something to block off between pens to give cows a little bit more seclusion, you could always use curtains or something that are a bit softer. So if the calf is born into it, it's not going to injure the calf. But again, we didn't see any problems with that in this case. But we did find that cows did like kind of the corner area, but they also really liked being in the doorway. So in this case, when we built this, we didn't know whether cows wanted 100% seclusion to come back here and hide away from everything, or if they like to have a view out and also an escape route. So we did find that a lot of cows ended up calving in the doorway, likely because, well, we don't know for sure, but it could be that they don't want 100% seclusion. It doesn't make sense for a herd animal to not be able to see and hear anything around them. So having the ability to still see out and kind of keep watch on their environment while still having a little bit of seclusion seemed to be important for them. So the next thing we did was we put 2 cows in the pen, because then we wanted to see, if they were trying to hide from each other, would this mean that they would be more likely to use the shelter if we had the second cow in the pen? But we actually found the opposite. So when you put the second cow in the pen, the cow is more likely to calve in the open area and avoid the shelter. So we can't be, well, the other thing we looked at was time spent, what we called away from partner. Essentially, this was in a different area of the pen than her partner. So if she was in the open pack and her partner was in the shelter, vice versa. So we did find that cows did try to separate themselves a little bit more from their partner right around calving. This is the same thing that we did with the shelter use, is we compared the 12 hours before with a 12-hour period a couple days before. And so right around, again, like 6 hours before calving, they start to increase the distance, or they're spending more time in an area away from their partner. So what could be happening here is the cows might be avoiding the shelter when their partner was there, either because there was no way out, it was sort of a dead end, or because their partner was already in the shelter. And we did see that a lot, is that cows did spend, they were all due around the same time. So we just looked at the first cow that calved, but maybe that second cow was already in, early stage of labor, or she was just interested in using that shelter. So another kind of anecdotal thing, which I'll show you a video on, is that we saw some competition over these shelters as well. So there were resources that the cows were willing to fight over. So, and we did not expect that, but I think it provides a lot of interesting information if we try to apply this idea to a group pen, as we have to think about this a lot harder than in an individual pen. So this is a video that shows this cow in the back here is already in labor. And she decides that nobody else is allowed in her shelter while she is calving. So you can see her tail is up. And she was in the back, but then decided that she needed to be in the front here and protect her space. So it was kind of an interesting little part of the study to find that it added a level of complexity when you added 2 cows in the pen that we weren't aware of ahead of time. So a follow-up study we did was we tried to make this idea a bit more practical. So this was a study that was done in Denmark with the University of Aarhus, where we had cows housed in individual pens that were directly adjacent to the group pen. So these were close-up cows here. When they're ready to calve, they got moved into this individual pen. It looks small, but it was 10 by 12 feet. So it was a decent size, or I'd say a kind of normal size individual box stall for the calves. And what we did is we made these sort of, again, about $50 with plywood. We put up these plywood corners for them. So they could hide here if they wanted to, or they could sit here or stand here and have head-to-head or nose-to-nose contact with cows in the group pen. So again, we looked at their behavior before calving, but then we were really interested in, did they choose to calve in what I call the corner side of the pen, or the window, or this is the side where they could see out and see other cows. And here our results were very clear that they really liked that corner. So there is something certainly about a corner that probably many of you have seen your cows do too, is they are very attracted to this idea of having a hiding space, or a place where they could separate themselves from their group mates. Again, we didn't see any problems with calves being born into the plywood, but I think here is where we can get a bit more creative. Instead of just the cheap plywood option, is to put something softer or something else as a barrier, as opposed to these plywood walls. A follow-up study my colleague at Denmark has run, she looked at different sizes and shapes of this corner, and she didn't really find a preference. Cows didn't care what it looked like, whether it was this high, whether it was 4 feet high or 5 feet high, or whether it was a bit wider or longer. They didn't really care so much about that. But what they did find was cows that had dystocias, or had longer labors, wanted the most seclusion. So they went to the biggest wall that they could get when they had a prolonged or a dystotic calving. Just kind of interesting. So kind of figuring out why that is. But that they want even more seclusion when they're experiencing more pain around calving. So show a couple more practical ways of doing this. This is a picture from a colleague at University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Ken Nordland. In this picture, you can see these are the maternity pens, so the individual box stalls. They'll put a layer of sand with straw on top of it when they move a cow into these pens. But they previously didn't have this curtain right here, so there was a lot of activity. These were, I don't know if these are close-up cows over here. I think they probably are. But, you know, the tractor's coming by a couple times a day. There's noises happening over here. There's an office over here. So what they ended up doing is putting this I would say rather large curtain, probably didn't need to be quite this high, especially if it's going to interfere with ventilation, but they put a barrier between their individual calving pens and the rest of the barn. And anecdotally, unfortunately, we weren't able to measure the effects on the cow, but this particular producer was really happy with their decision because they found that their first calf heifers especially had lower dystocias. So perhaps giving them that privacy is allowing them to be less stressed during labor and allowing them to calve more naturally. So we are taking that idea and applying it in a new study that we're studying. We're starting actually in May of this year to see if you do provide cows with this opportunity to hide, does it affect their ability to give birth normally? So does it affect dystocias? Does it have effects on milk production and metritis and other things after calving? This is another picture. This one's from Ohio. So you might, maybe you're in the audience. I don't know. Maybe you've been to this farm, but from Vandermaid. I got this picture from Kayla Chapman. So this is a individual maternity pen. I believe the milking parlor is over here, at least the holding area. So they did have a noisier part of the barn on this side. So they ended up putting up a corrugated metal wall here to separate their cows from the noise and activity. So a couple of different ways that you can kind of take this idea and apply it to at least individual calving pens. So one of our next questions is what about a group pen? So do cows want seclusion in a group pen? Can we give them seclusion in a group pen, and how do we do that? So I don't have the answer to that question. And the other kind of question that we're going to ask, we are doing a study to ask this question, but we don't have the data yet. But the other question I get a lot is what should be the stocking density of a group calving pen? And for a long time, 100 square feet has been thrown around per cow. In my opinion, just based on what I know of cow behavior right around calving, that is not enough. So we're going to compare 100 square feet to 200 square feet to see if that impacts their calving behavior and their ability, again, to calve normally. And if that sort of interacts with their ability to find a hiding space. So I will show you some preliminary data that we have from New Zealand. So this was a study, again, done with crossbreds, but cows in New Zealand are essentially, they're grazed all year round. They're extensively managed. But right around calving in this particular farm, they bring the cows into this compost bedded area right before or during the close-up period. And when this is essentially their maternity pen. So they want them to give birth here. But they only bring them in the evening and at night. And then in the daytime, they're out on pasture, hoping, of course, that most of them calve indoors, or not indoors, but in this bedded pack. So here we put up these kind of L-shape hides for them. So you can see this cow kind of exploring it, that are foldable. So we wanted something very practical, but also provided some seclusion, but not too much. I don't know if it was the right design, but it was our first idea for this. So we had 100 cows before calving. In the daytime, they're on pasture, and then overnight or in the evening, so there was a little bit of light outside still when they moved in. And then we randomized them into one of two pads. One of the pads, actually both of them had these foldable pens, but every night we changed which pad had them actually open. So they were sort of randomly assigned to either not having access to these because they were folded up, or having access to them because they were open. So this is a video that shows them opening, and you can see the other pad is right there. It's pretty much identical. So if these were open, then they would close those. And then would bring cows in here to see if they would calve, to see where they would calve, if they would use these kind of L-shaped hides. So this image shows where cows chose to calve without the hides. So when they went into the pad with no hide. So you can see there's certainly some patterns in where they chose to calve. They did this is the entryway over here. So many of them were actually near the entryway. Certainly many of them were against the wall. Not a lot of them in the middle, which again is what we would expect. They like corners, or they at least like some form of protection around them. And very similar on this other side too. They avoided the middle. They sort of liked the corners. So then this shows where cows calved when they had access to the hides. So you can see we had expected some of them to at least use the hides, but we knew that there was going to be social competition that would influence this. That's why we had so many hides for them. And then maybe the hides were too hidden. Maybe it was too much of a sort of dark space, and also it was overnight. So we didn't have a lot of cows actually use the hides. Could be because it was overnight, could be because it was social competition. We had just a couple of them. You do see a lot of the cows still sort of placing themselves near the hides. But then something really interesting happened, and this is not something that we had expected or anticipated, but actually is kind of cool, kind of interesting. Not sure how we're going to apply it to the real world outside of New Zealand, but I think it was kind of interesting. So again, 48 cows calved without a hide, 53 calved with access to hides. Those with access to hides, most of them did not use the hides. But we saw some cows do kind of something peculiar. So we had video cameras over all these cows. Here's a cow exploring one of the hides just before calving. About 30 minutes later, she calved just outside of the hide. Just about an hour later, her calf moved inside the hide, and that's where they found them in the morning. So if we didn't have these cameras, they may have thought that this calf was born in the hide, but actually they moved in after calving. So from the farmer's perspective, this is great because then he or she knows where to find the calves. The calves were, if they were to move themselves or calve in here, then that would be very useful for them. So then we went back and looked at all the calves and cows that moved into hides after calving. And it was pretty remarkable. So you can see that most of the cows and the calves ended up in the hides, but not until after they gave birth. So we're still trying to figure this one out too, so we have lots of video data to go through. It seems like it's really the calf that's leading the way, so we can't tell for sure, obviously, but it could be that the calf is looking for a more secluded, but also maybe protected from wind and protected from other things when they're in this more hidden area. So here's a picture. Again, we saw a lot of cows that sort of stood at the doorway while their calf was hidden until the farm manager came the next morning to pick up all the calves. So looking at the video, it looked like it was about, and on average, about 2.5 hours after birth, the calves were moved. So again, in a sort of commercial setting, the calf usually isn't with the cow for this long, although overnight they might be. But the range was about 22 minutes to 8 hours. So I'm not sure what we're going to do with this. I think this is kind of a really interesting finding and tells us a lot about maybe the calf's behavior and the cow's behavior. But just kind of a cool preliminary finding from this study. I think a take-home message, though, is that these hides didn't do what we wanted them to do. So the cows didn't use them to calve, and we have to figure out why and figure out what a better solution would be. Okay, so to wrap up maternity, and then I'll have a couple minutes to talk about fresh pen, but I want to spend most of the time talking about the maternity pen. Is what we've learned is cows want a quiet, low-stress environment, ideally with a hiding space or at least separated from the high traffic area of the barn. So if you have your calving pens right next to the parlor or somewhere where you know there's a lot of activity, is there something that you can put? Maybe it's hay bales, maybe or straw bales, maybe it's a curtain, maybe there's something that you can put between the maternity area and more noisy parts of the barn to reduce that noise.